The day my husband chose an important work meeting over my cancer diagnosis, I realized I had become part of his furniture. Beautiful, expensive, but replaceable. All this realization came to me as I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and tried to adjust my dress, checking myself in the mirror. I had long ago learned that the perfect wife for Steve had to be not only beautiful, but also impeccably prepared for all the social events of his life. The dress I picked out fit my figure perfectly, but at this moment it didn't matter. I didn't see myself in that dress. I saw only my role that I played in this world, a role in which my existence had no weight except to add glitz and glamour to Steve's successful life. Steve was set for an important meeting, and tonight, as always, was his night. I knew it. A corporate ball to which he planned to arrive in the spotlight, in the company of the company's top executives. He was on the verge of getting a new promotion, and I was his only but essential accessory. The evening was going to culminate in another victory for Steve, which meant I needed to live up to those expectations. Anything more than a slight shift in that role, and I would become redundant, like an unnecessary detail. As always, I chose everything with the smallest of details in mind: the right dress, the right shoes, the right manicure. Everything had to be perfect, but when I looked at myself, I didn't see a woman. I saw an empty shell adjusting to someone else's standards and desires. Steve certainly wasn't going to criticize me, but he couldn't seem to appreciate me anymore either. I didn't need to expect compliments or even looks from him. I had become part of his image, and that was enough. The house was quiet, as had been our conversation over the past few months. Since Lisa had left for college 2 months ago, there was nothing left in the house to fill the void. It wasn't evident in his eyes. Steve had always been busy, consumed by a career that left little room for anything else. Holidays, weekends, everything passed by, and I became part of the furniture that could just be moved and forgotten about. I pulled out my phone and checked the messages from Steve. "Running late, I'll meet you there. Don't forget to bring a gift for the CEO's wife." As always, I had already wrapped the gift, choosing silver-colored wrapping paper that perfectly matched her decor. The gift wasn't just good, it was impeccable. After all, I always had an eye for detail, remembering every little detail, every drop in the sea of her requests and preferences. All to be inconspicuous, but perfect. Finally, I headed for the cab, and the ride gave me some time to sink into my thoughts. 20 years ago, when Steve and I first met, he was different. He was a humble student trying to get out of debt and making a living with part-time jobs. I was the daughter of one of his professors, helping out in the department by cataloging books. He would bring me coffee and leave me notes with funny comments on textbooks. That's when he really noticed me. He saw that I was something more than just a woman who helped him with his studies. He believed in us. But that was then. Now Steve was the kind of man who, with each passing year, became more successful and more detached from anything that didn't involve his career. I was no more important to him than a well-chosen tie for an important meeting. And so the years passed. I became part of the decor, part of the perfect image. I was beautiful, but I no longer existed as a person for him. Time passed, and I continued on my journey, playing the role of the perfect wife. I knew I had to be in the right place at the right time, and now I was standing in the hotel lobby surrounded by other women who were also playing their role. The role of wives whose husbands were successful and who looked at us as the jewelry of the world. I felt like I was in a theater where everyone had to do their part perfectly. Steve noticed me immediately, as he always did, his gaze sliding around the room, and I realized that his heart was unaffected by my presence. He was in his element, surrounded by colleagues, managers, senior executives. They were discussing profits, strategies, global plans. I approached Steve, and his gaze met me with the same slight boredom I'd come to feel over the past few years. He didn't see me again. "Sarah, dear?" he said with a smile. But I noticed his eyes sliding around the room again, looking for someone important to talk to later. We exchanged a few phrases, and then he was absorbed in talking business again. As always, I was in the background. We approached the CEO's wife, and I handed her a gift that seemed like the perfect choice given her crystal collection. Her eyes lit up, and Steve complimented me on my choice, though his gaze was already far away from me. He wasn't interested in how I felt or how I was even doing with this gift. It didn't matter to me, but I had to smile and pretend I was thrilled with the part. Everything continued as usual. Smiles, compliments, listening attentively to other people's conversations, Steve's discreet encouragement. I could have been in any other woman's shoes, and it would have been the same. I was well prepared, as always. But something began to grow inside me, in some strange and unexpected way. My role didn't satisfy me. It wasn't living. It was just functioning. As the evening went on, I felt more and more that the longer I stayed at this ball, the more I was losing myself. I moved around the room like a good actress playing her part. The smiles, the compliments, the easy jokes you have to say to keep from falling out of character. Every phrase, every movement, all thought out in advance. But in this world full of glitter and fake smiles, I felt like a shadow just slipping around the room. James continued to carry on conversations with partners, co-workers, the CEO, as if I were just part of the entourage. He seemed oblivious to me, despite the fact that we had spent almost 20 years together. I remembered how he had once actually seen me. When we met at university, when he used to bring me coffee and scribble notes in my textbooks, we'd started out as partners in life and in love, and now he hadn't even noticed that I felt lost in this new role. My gaze kept sliding around the room, stopping on the faces of the people I had to interact with. Women in luxurious dresses, men discussing their business, invited guests who knew how to arrange their lives perfectly. I was part of this picture composition, nothing more than a background, a decorative element that simply had to be in this setting. I was sitting at dinner between two women whose names I barely remembered, making small talk about the countries where they had vacationed on their recent vacations. James was engrossed in something important, discussing the next phase of the company's expansion. He didn't notice his food getting cold. That was normal. I knew he would need to get it to the right state. As always, I would make his favorite snack when we got home. I was used to doing everything ahead of time. I was in my role and everything seemed right, but suddenly I felt something I hadn't felt before. I wasn't alone in this huge hall, but I felt as alone as possible. It was as if I was transparent, like an airy substance, and everyone around me existed for their own purposes, for their own pursuits. I suddenly realized that I had always been something in his life that was not visible. Like air, I was necessary but invisible, unnoticed. No one noticed me. No one thought of me. I was just an ornament, necessary to make the world look the way it should to everyone else. And then, at that moment, I realized I couldn't be like that anymore. And so, the moment came that broke everything for me. Steve began his speech, thanking everyone for their support, for the opportunity to move on, for believing in his abilities. As always, the words flattered his ambition. They moved him forward. And then he said a few words to me, barely glancing at me. And of course, my wonderful wife, who has always been there for me and supported me. It wasn't a speech about us. It wasn't a story about how we had survived all the hardships and joys. It was just a formulaic mention, an empty phrase, an empty word, support. I felt so hurt that I could barely contain myself. I stood by her side and everything inside me disintegrated. Just like that, just one word and I was disappearing, becoming part of the background, part of the decor that could be changed whenever I wanted. I became this object that could simply be used to decorate my life. The word supportive became synonymous with how I had been seen all these years. I was someone who wasn't noticed, who was simply there but not felt. Steve continued his speech, but I was no longer listening. My thoughts were tossing to and fro, and the realization that I had become this empty object, this perfect wife, was overwhelming me more and more. Why was I playing this role? Why was I letting him act like I was transparent? When had all of this started? After the speech was over, I quickly fell back into my normal routine. I was back to being the one who laughs, smiles, and supports everyone. I just walked through the evening doing my part like a good actress until something inside me cracked. For too long, I had played my part, and for too long, I had remained invisible to those around me. My inner torment melted away, and I felt that I could no longer continue in this role. I could no longer be just a piece of furniture in Steve's life. When I got into the cab, my heart wouldn't calm down. I tried to focus on something else, on idle conversation with the driver or how nice it felt to sit in the comfortable chair, but nothing worked. We drove past expensive stores and classy restaurants, and it seemed to me that this city only existed for people like Steve. People who didn't notice what was happening to those who just needed to be around. The people around me lived in their own world, full of accomplishments and triumphs and ambitions. But I was just part of the background, part of the decor that could be moved around at any moment. I looked at this world through the window, trying to realize how long ago I stopped being visible, not only to others, but also to myself. My thoughts went back to when I first met Steve, when we were still young and hopeful. He was so different then, a student who had no wealth or confidence, but who still glowed with the bright fire of desire. He wasn't the man you see now, successful, bossy, and ruthless in his quest to be on top. He wasn't someone who could easily forget about you. He saw me. He looked at me like I was the most important person in his world. But something had changed. I couldn't say exactly when, but as the years went by, I became less and less important in his life. It was gradual, like the cracks in the walls of an old house that you don't notice until one day you realize they've already destroyed the entire structure. The cab pulled up to the hotel, and I stepped onto the shiny tiles of the lobby, which seemed colder than when I'd first arrived here. This hotel was where Steve could showcase himself in the best light, and I could be his untouchable, perfect companion. I was prepared as always: dress, hair, makeup, smile, everything perfect, but I felt like I wasn't there. I came as part of his perfect image, as an accessory that should emphasize his success, his status. But in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just forgotten. I had disappeared. When I entered the hall, I immediately noticed how Steve, surrounded by important people, didn't immediately notice me. He was in his element, playing his part as he always did. I was standing next to him, but I didn't exist. I was smiling, holding conversations as he expected, but deep down I felt an emptiness that increasingly encompassed me. Once upon a time, he and I had been partners, but tonight I was part of his entourage, nothing more. Steve's gaze slid over me, but I knew he couldn't see me anymore. Since Lisa left for college, our house had become even emptier, and I didn't know how to fill it. Steve didn't notice the emptiness either. It had become the norm. It was enough for him to know that I was around, that I was doing my part. I approached Steve, and he looked at me with his usual smile, but it wasn't evident in his eyes. He was once again absorbed in conversation, and my words just dissolved into thin air. He talked about his work, his accomplishments, his future, but it wasn't about me. It wasn't about us. When I spoke a few sentences, he just nodded, his gaze already sliding around the room, looking for more important people to talk to. I remained standing nearby, not too intrusive, but not too conspicuous either. I was there, but still sort of absent. I became a part of his life that no longer touched me. With every step I took in that hall, I felt my role become more and more meaningless. Everyone around me was busy talking, doing important things, and making jokes that sounded sincere but had no life in them. I walked down the hall, handing out smiles and compliments like a trained puppet, but inside everything was empty. Steve was once again the center of attention, talking to the CEO and his colleagues. He was always in his element, and I knew he didn't need me in this moment. His life was about his career, his accomplishments, and I remained a quiet shadow in his perfect world. I remembered how it all started. When we first met at university, when he was just an ordinary student who had no status, no million in his account, but who genuinely loved me. He would look at me then, and I felt that his attention really mattered to me. He would bring me coffee in the library and leave notes in my textbooks. We were partners, and nothing was more important than supporting each other. But over time, his success became more important than me. His career superseded everything else, and I, as a wife, became just part of his image. That night was like any other, but the longer I stayed there, the more I felt how much I was losing myself. I was once again playing the role of the perfect wife, the supportive, invisible one who should just be there for me. But the longer I stayed in this state, the clearer I realized that this role no longer satisfied me. I could no longer just be Steve's wife. I wanted to be me, but that seemed impossible in this world full of demands and expectations. I stood among people who didn't notice me, among those who lived their lives and tried to figure out what I needed to do to reclaim my life for myself. Steve continued his talks, and I found myself once again in a secondary role. I just smiled and nodded as everyone expected, but inside I could feel everything inside me crumbling. I couldn't be just a shadow in his world anymore. I wanted to be visible. I wanted to be me, not his accessory. But how do you do that when you've been lurking in the shadows for so many years? At one point, Steve suddenly rose from his seat and stepped away, continuing to negotiate with his coworkers. I was left alone amidst the empty conversations and vain smiles. I knew my role perfectly well. I had to be perfect. The perfect wife who doesn't stand out, who doesn't demand attention, yet is present, supportive, and always there for me. I knew that if I stepped even slightly outside of that role, if I dared to do anything out of the ordinary, I would lose everything. Steve wouldn't forgive that. I no longer existed as a person. I was just part of the world he was building around me. I sat at a table with other women who were like me, also the perfect wives of successful men. We talked about simple things, trips, kids, fashion. But it wasn't real communication. It was just filling in empty space to make time go by. We were all part of the same game without thinking about how it was actually affecting us. I became part of that game, playing my part, but at some point it became unbearable. All that talking, all that laughing, it was all so empty. I no longer wanted to be this background, this empty decoration. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be heard. I wanted to be me, not someone's shadow. When dinner was over and Steve approached me again, I felt the chasm between us begin to grow. He was absorbed in discussions with his coworkers, kept talking about business and future plans. I smiled and nodded, but there was silence inside me. I didn't know how to be anymore. I tried to remember those moments when he and I were happy, when we had something in common other than his career. We talked about the future, made plans, but that was a long time ago. Things are different now. I was a part of his life, but no longer more than an additional accessory to his success. My thoughts were interrupted by another moment when he said something about his new deal with the partners, and I noticed his eyes start to wander around the room again, looking for someone more important than me. It was so obvious that I couldn't ignore it. Steve had never looked at me the way he had before. I wasn't the woman he was building his life with. I was part of his outside world, the part he needed to maintain his image. And so, standing next to him, I realized that this couldn't go on any longer. Instead of continuing to remain silent and smiling, I felt something click in my heart at some point. I couldn't just be a shadow anymore. I couldn't continue to live like this, to be his accessory. I was a woman who was waiting for something more, and I knew I had to make the first move. Maybe he wouldn't notice it. Maybe things would stay the same, but in that moment I decided I couldn't be invisible anymore. After dinner, we went to his office where Steve went back to work. He had taken off his jacket and was already starting to check some documents, discussing the details of the next deal with the partners. I stood in the doorway watching him. He was absorbed in his tasks, and I felt myself disappearing again. He didn't notice me standing there, didn't notice the change inside me. He didn't see me. again. I walked over to his desk, put a glass of water in front of him, and didn't say a word. He continued to discuss something with someone on the phone, not paying attention to me. I figured I wouldn't stop now even if I wanted to. I couldn't be his shadow, his background anymore. I needed to make a change, but not for him. I couldn't go on living without seeing myself. Steve was too absorbed in his work. He was talking again about how he needed to go to a meeting with the partners next month, how important it was to finalize negotiations on a new project. I stood listening and realized that to him, I had become just part of this routine, part of his schedule, part of his life that didn't require attention. I watched him become that man again, the man who thinks only of himself and his success. I needed to make a move. I didn't know how, but I knew I needed to. I couldn't keep sitting around waiting for him to return his attention to me. I could no longer be a woman whose existence was reduced to supporting his career. I picked up my phone and wrote a quick message that wasn't related to his job or what I should do. I didn't know what was next, but it was the first step, and I realized that reading it would change a lot of things. Not me, but he had to realize that something was broken in our home. As I stood in the empty kitchen preparing a snack for Steve, I could feel the emptiness inside me becoming more and more palpable. My hands mechanically sliced apples and placed them on a plate, but I couldn't help but think about how empty and meaningless it had all become. I wasn't doing it because I wanted to take care of him, but because I had already fulfilled that role for so many years that I didn't know how to live without it. It was like a mesmerizing routine, like walking in a circle I couldn't get out of. I looked at my hands, which were so skillful at making his nightly snack, apples with honey and cinnamon. I knew he loved it, that he couldn't sleep soundly without it. But did he ever think about how I felt standing in that kitchen? Did he ever consider who I was other than what I might be to him in this moment? No, of course he didn't. He was busy with his career, his plans, and I was just a part of his picture life that could be framed in a convenient way. I lifted my head and looked at the empty space around me. The house was a silence that seemed deeper than the empty space I was immersed in. Lisa had left for college, and now this house was just a cage where I existed as a quiet, unnoticed element. I took a step toward the window, looking out at the city at night. Lights on the streets, cars, people. But I stood here, alone in this empty kitchen, preparing his snack. I realized that this was not life. This was existence. But what if I could make a difference? What if I could stop being invisible? To myself? I was reminded again of that moment when I realized I couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. Steve never noticed that I had changed, that my thoughts no longer revolved around his needs. He continued his conversation on the phone without noticing me. He was completely absorbed in the business at hand, but I felt something important happening inside me. I couldn't continue to be his shadow. I couldn't stay invisible and just fulfill my role. I lifted my head, looked at myself in the reflection in the window, and realized that if I didn't make a move now, I could stay in this oblivion forever. I put the apples with honey and cinnamon back on the table, and then as I looked at them, I realized that all of this was just a way to continue living by the rules I had set for myself. But what if I started taking steps that didn't depend on him? What if I did things for myself? As I set my snack plate on the table, I noticed Steve enter the kitchen without paying much attention to me. He was already in his usual pose, relaxed, like a man who is used to getting everything he needs and not noticing the changes going on around him. He simply walked over, looked at the apples with honey and cinnamon, nodded, said a few words of thanks, and sat down at the table. He was absorbed in his thoughts again, checking some paperwork on his phone, and I sat across from him, like an empty world with nothing but him and his business. I felt like I was gone again. How I was becoming part of this empty life that had no meaning. He didn't see me, didn't notice me changing. He kept talking about his work, about new projects, as always, not paying attention to my feelings. I could talk to him, but I realized he wouldn't be interested. He didn't ask how I was feeling, what was going on with me. To him, I was just a convenient figure in his perfect world. I'm his support, his good wife who always does what needs to be done, and I was tired of being that. He took the apples with honey and cinnamon and started eating without stopping to look at his phone screen. It was so painful. With every movement, with every sip, I felt myself disappearing. He didn't notice me, didn't feel what was happening to me. I could disappear right now and he wouldn't care. I remembered her eyes, the woman he always put on a pedestal, the one he wanted to live with, the one he was happy with. Where is she now? Where was she when I had become an empty shell, capable only of giving and supporting, with no right to my own dreams or desires? But now I've decided that I won't be like that anymore. I can't continue to be a woman whose dreams and desires don't matter. I can't continue to be a shadow who is just there to maintain his perfect world. I can't continue to fulfill my role without question, without a sense of self-importance. I looked at him, and in that moment I realized that I could no longer be his perfect wife. I couldn't continue to live his life while losing my own. That was the moment when everything inside me caught fire, when I felt that something had to change. That night, like all the others, ended and Steve retired to his office, continuing his work, and I was left alone in silence. He didn't see me trying to focus on what I needed to do to change my life. He didn't see that moment when I, standing in front of him, realized that I could no longer be his accessory, his shadow, his support that was always invisible. I felt something inside me breaking out of this trapped circle, out of the role I had been forced to accept so many years ago. But what would I do next? I stood in the empty room staring at the walls that seemed to grow even colder with each passing year. These walls were once filled with warmth, laughter, hope, but now they only reflected my loneliness, my invisibility. I didn't know how I could move on, how I could start over. I could just stay here and carry on as I always had, but that wouldn't be fair. I knew that if I stayed, I would completely disappear. I needed to find a way to break free. I went back to the phone I had held for so long, but which I hadn't used for anything important. I dialed Steve's number, and it wasn't until I heard him answer that I realized this was my last opportunity to tell him what I'd been silent for so long. "Steve, I can't go on living like this," I uttered, not knowing what else to add. He didn't say anything, but I knew this moment would change everything. We could no longer continue to be who we were. I couldn't continue to support his image like I had supported him my whole life. Before I could finish talking, I hung up the phone because I realized I needed to do more than just talk. I needed to walk away. I needed to find a way to be myself again, to not depend on his success, his image, his life. I needed to break free, to find my own life. Perhaps I would be lonely, but that loneliness now seemed so much more appealing than the life I had been invisible in. I started packing, slowly, carefully, as if I didn't want to believe this was actually happening. I packed my things, but not because I had to go. I packed them to finally realize I couldn't stay in this house, in this life, any longer. I couldn't continue living as its accessory. I had to reclaim my identity, reclaim my freedom. When I finished packing my things, I stood in the center of the empty room and looked at the pictures that hung on the walls. Steve and I at different events, his victories, his successes, his life. In the eyes of all these people, we were the perfect family. I was the perfect wife. He was the perfect husband. But in those pictures, I didn't see myself. I didn't see the woman who was once full of life, who once truly loved him. I saw only a woman who was frozen in her role, a woman who was becoming more invisible with each passing year. I stood in front of this picture, in front of this perfect image we had created, and realized that it no longer made sense to me. I could no longer be who I was. I could no longer go on living my life pretending that I was okay with everything. At that moment, I realized that this was a moment of change for me. I couldn't go on like this, and I knew that my move today would change everything. I left a letter for Steve, short but succinct. I didn't know if he would read it or just move on like he always did, but I wrote it because I needed to tell him that I was leaving, not because he didn't love me, but because I couldn't be a part of his world anymore. I couldn't continue to be the person he overlooked. I was leaving to find myself again, to be seen, to start living my life again. I grabbed my bags, which contained everything I needed, and closed the door of our house behind me. It was the last time I would leave it. It was a release. I no longer had to be a part of his perfect world. I walked out, and even though I knew hardship and loneliness awaited me, I felt it was the right move. I was getting my life back. I rode in a cab, and the city outside the window seemed completely foreign. As I drove past familiar streets, I couldn't believe that I was actually leaving Steve and everything that made up my old life. I wasn't just leaving home, I was leaving everything. The role I'd played and the person I was no longer. It was a decision I had made, but as soon as I got into the cab, the world around me began to seem somehow both distant and close at the same time. The streets were so familiar, but everything was different. My gaze slid down the glass, and I thought about what awaited me. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't continue to be a part of this empty world. Everything I had done before was for the sake of others, for Steve, to fulfill his expectations and the role he wanted for me. But now, as I stood on the threshold of a new life, I needed to find myself. I remembered all those moments when, even though I was there for him, I felt completely invisible. I was standing next to him, playing my part, the beautiful, successful wife. But a feeling of emptiness was building up inside me. And now I was here, on my way to a new world that no one had called me to, but where I could be myself. The cab turned down a new street, and I suddenly felt this place felt different. It wasn't the world I was leaving. It was a completely different world, a world where I could be myself. I didn't know where I would live. I didn't know how I would settle. But I knew one thing. I was ready to start from scratch. My thoughts kept coming back to Steve, to what I had left behind. He never understood why I left. He went on with his life, and I wasn't even sure he'd ever realize what he'd lost. But right now, I couldn't think about what had happened before. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I was starting a new life. Everything I'd been through couldn't define who I was anymore. I arrived in the city that had become my new home and stood on the platform, waiting for a cab to take me to the apartment I had rented. The streets were noisy. People walked by without paying attention to me. Everything was new, and I felt this new world fill me with an unknown sense of freedom. I could finally be myself, and it was an amazing feeling, a sense of my own space, my own time. My new apartment was small but cozy. It didn't have luxurious, expensive carpets or furniture like Steve's house, but I already knew that it was a place I would feel alive in. I could put the cup I liked on the table and not worry about how it looked from other people's perspectives. It was simpler than that. There were no masks or expectations in this place. It was just me. And this was my new life. I unwrapped my bags, unfolding the things I had taken with me. Everything was so ordinary, so simple, but I didn't feel alone. I felt like this moment, like every step I took was leading me to something important. I was no longer part of someone else's perfect picture. I was myself. A few hours later, when I already felt like I had my little corner set up, I called Lisa. She answered in surprise, but I could feel her voice warming. "Mom, did you really do this?" she asked. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it, and I could hear the surprise and maybe even relief in her voice. She was finally beginning to realize that I, too, had a right to my life, to my freedom. We talked about the future, about how she was adjusting to college. She calmed down, and I felt all my resolve strengthen. I couldn't continue to be a part of a world where I was overlooked. I did it for me. When I woke up the next morning, I didn't feel tired, even though it had been a long night. In the empty apartment, with its smell of new furniture and fresh colors, I felt a strange sense of contentment. It felt like I had just taken a big step forward. I opened the window, and fresh air filled my room. It was so clean and relaxed, like my new world that I was just beginning to enter. There was no room in this world for fake smiles and roles I had to play for others. I looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't recognize myself, but it wasn't scary. It was liberating. My eyes, which had previously been clouded with worries about Steve, now seemed clear. I didn't know where this path would lead me, but I was no longer afraid of it. This was my new beginning, a beginning where I could be honest with myself and with the world. In that moment, I realized that I no longer needed anyone else's approval. I no longer needed to play the role of the perfect wife who always keeps her distance and hides her true feelings. I could be vulnerable, I could make mistakes, and I could be human. I could be myself and not depend on what others expected. I could choose my path and follow it without fear. As I packed up and walked outside to experience this new city, I felt like I was part of something bigger than just a simple woman who was once someone's wife. I felt that I had a right to be here, that this city could be my home. I walked down the street, and even though it had only been a few days since I had been here, it felt like I had lived here my whole life. I walked into cafes, watching people who didn't know me, who didn't expect me to do anything but be myself. It was a joyous feeling of freedom. No one expected me to be perfect. No one forced me to be someone's shadow. Here I was, a real, genuine woman, and that was all I needed. I began to build my new life, one step at a time. I went to the local cafes in the mornings, sitting at tables with a cup of coffee and a book, noting something, thinking something. I absorbed the world like never before, feeling new events fill my space. I didn't rush, didn't worry about a future that might not even be in sight yet. I savored every moment because I knew I was living for myself, not for others. A few days passed, and I started receiving my first phone calls. I was offered jobs. I was invited to events. And all this was possible because I learned to believe in myself. I was no longer a hidden figure who had to sit in a corner and smile. I was an active part of my world, and I didn't need validation or excuses. I was in my place. I decided to try my hand at something new and enrolled in an event management course. It wasn't related to my past role as the wife of a successful businessman, but it was because I had always been good at organizing and coordinating. This was my chance to start afresh, to develop my personality and abilities that had been hidden for too long. When I first came to the class, I was a little awkward, but I quickly realized that this was what I was meant to do. These courses were a new step in my life, the first step to discovering myself as a person. On my way home in the evening, I called Lisa again. She was happy for me, for my choice, and in her voice, I felt the support I had been looking for so long. It wasn't just the support of a daughter, it was the support of a woman who saw me. And in that moment, I realized that maybe I had become the person she had always been waiting for, a woman who could be strong despite everything that had come before. When I made the decision to move on, I didn't know what was in store for me, but I could feel something changing inside of me. My world was becoming simpler, but it was in that simplicity that I began to find my strength. For the first time in a long time, I woke up without worry. There was no one expecting me to do his bidding, no routine that had held me back for years. I woke up in my new apartment, small but cozy, and felt the air around me light and fresh. I could be myself, and it was an amazing feeling of freedom. I stood at the window, looking out at the world beyond. The people, the cars, the buildings, everything went on, but now I was part of this world, not its background. I didn't have to be just a shadow in Steve's life anymore. I could be someone more. I could be a woman who chooses her own path, not just following someone else's expectations. That moment was a turning point for me. For the first time in years, I felt that all my worries, all my effort and suffering had not been in vain. I was ready for new challenges and new opportunities. Every day I realized more and more that I did not regret my decision. There was no disappointment or doubt. I began to realize that my life was not just a role that had been thrust upon me. It is not a script written for someone else. It is my path, and I am now in control of what happens. And while there were many unknowns ahead, I was ready to face them with an open heart. My morning passed quietly. I made myself a coffee, sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started looking for new opportunities. I knew that I wanted to work, that I needed to realize my abilities and hobbies. I couldn't afford to stay in the shadows, in the state I was in before. I had enough skills and experience to start from scratch. I wasn't going to continue to sit around and wait for someone to notice me. I was ready to be proactive. A few days passed, and I managed to find an event management course, something I had wanted to try for a long time. It was a step into the future. I signed up for the course and looked forward to the first class. At that moment, I felt my energy returning, everything around me starting to fill with new meaning. This was my chance to become the person I had always wanted to be, and I was not going to miss it. The event management course was a real eye-opener for me. It was so fascinating that I started to forget about all the doubts that were in my mind before. Every lesson, every meeting with teachers and colleagues on the course gave me new knowledge, new ideas, and inspiration. I could feel my self-confidence returning. I was no longer just a woman who once sat in the background of life, ignored and unnoticed. I began to realize that I had a talent that I could develop. I became active in the class, offered my ideas and concepts for projects, and received support in return. These people who were on the course didn't know me as someone's wife, as the wife of a successful businessman. They saw me as a person, and I felt how important that was to me. Not to be someone's shadow, not to be an add-on, but to be myself, on an equal footing with the other people I was now meeting. One of the first real projects of the course was an event plan for a small corporate dinner we were organizing with a group. It was a great chance to prove myself. I took responsibility for several important aspects: decorations, logistics, coordination with suppliers. Although I was nervous, I realized that it was a chance to prove myself, to show my strengths. I began to realize how many opportunities open up when you are not afraid to be yourself. When the event was successful, I felt how I started to like this job. I was happy that I was able to do something real, something meaningful, not for someone else, but for myself. I saw the results of my labor, and it inspired me even more. It was the moment when I realized that I could build my own career without relying on other people's expectations and ambitions. As I drove home in the evening, I felt that freedom fill me again. I had my own path, and I could follow it without looking back. I was ready for new opportunities and new heights. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that I was now in control of my own future. Everything that had happened before seemed far away, and I was ready to leave it behind. Week after week, I continued to immerse myself in my new world. Each day brought new tasks, new challenges, and I felt my strength growing more and more. I began to feel that I was standing my ground, that I was on my way to building my career, my life, and no longer needed to seek validation of my existence in other people's eyes. I discovered new possibilities and felt that I could finally do what I loved. I could be a woman in control of my life, and it was an incredible revelation. Every new assignment, every client meeting, every project was a lesson for me. I was no longer afraid of making mistakes. I learned to accept them, learn from them, and move on. It was so liberating. I didn't demand that I be perfect. I learned, I made mistakes, I got better, and it gave me confidence. I became more confident in my abilities than I had ever been before. I was once a woman who sat in the background fulfilling other people's expectations and always remaining invisible. Now I was in the foreground at the center of things. When I finished one of the projects, I felt like it was more than just a job. It was more than that. I wasn't just organizing an event. I was creating. It was mine. And in that moment, I realized that I was able to step out of the shadows and build something that belonged only to me. It wasn't just a professional success, it was a personal success. I was able to find myself, and that was the most important accomplishment. That night, when we finished another project, I came home feeling so proud of myself. Even though I still felt the emptiness of leaving my old life behind, I knew it was a necessary step. I could no longer be a part of someone else's world. I was ready to create my own, even if it meant going through a lot of struggles. When I called Lisa, I no longer felt any shame or regret. I was ready to tell her about what I had built, that my life was now my own. "Are you proud of me?" I asked her. In her voice, I heard support and pride. It was the moment I realized that my path had become part of her path. We had become equals, and that was the greatest gift I could give myself. The following months were a real challenge, but they were also a time for self-development and growth. I continued to grow my career by organizing new events and expanding my network of contacts. I could feel how more and more people began to see me, not just as the wife of a successful man, but as a professional who could perform at the highest level. I wasn't just managing processes. I was inspiring people, making their lives brighter, and it felt exciting. One day, I was asked to participate in the organization of a major event related to a global business forum. It was an incredible opportunity for me. I felt like I was about to take another major step that would change everything. This was my big challenge. When I took on the responsibility of organizing the event, I realized that everything I had learned over the past months now applied in real life. My day started at 7 a.m. and ended well past midnight. There was so much work to do that sometimes I didn't have time to eat or even get some rest. But every moment was meaningful. Every step, every call, every meeting made me feel like I was on the right path. It was hard for me, but I felt it was worth it. I was a woman who was determining her own destiny, not following other people's expectations. When the event finally happened, I stood among the guests, watching everything work perfectly. Everything I had planned, everything I had organized, had become a reality. It was the moment I realized how far I had come from the moment I was deciding whether or not to leave Steve. I realized that I was back to myself, back in my life, and now I wasn't just an observer, but an actor in my own world. A few months passed, and my new world, the one in which I had become myself, finally became familiar. I learned to enjoy every day. Life, which had once seemed boring, monotonous, and full of expectations of other people, now opened new horizons before me. I stood on the threshold of a whole new stage, and I wondered what would happen next. I began to notice how much I had changed. When I walked down the street, I didn't feel alien to the world. I didn't feel like I had to be someone else. I could be myself, and it was an amazing feeling of freedom. I was proud that I was able to leave everything behind and start from scratch. It wasn't just a new place, it wasn't just a new home, it was a new me. But despite all of this, I still felt like something was left unfinished. I knew a lot of things had changed, but some things, some connections, remained behind, invisible, like unbreakable threads that were pulling me back. I can't say I was hurt, but it felt like I was missing something. I couldn't get over Steve. He wouldn't get out of my head, and while I'm sure he went on with his life, I couldn't escape the memory that we had once been partners. It wasn't regret for what was gone, it was a sense of loss, as if I had left a part of myself behind in that world. When I got a call from work offering to organize another big event, I knew it was a chance to take the next step. I needed to develop further, to grow in my profession. This event was big, and I decided I had to do it perfectly, like never before. I had no fear. I wasn't afraid of failure because I now knew I could do anything. I was ready to challenge myself and prove that I wasn't dependent on other people's opinions, on other people's expectations. This was my time. And so, standing in the audience, organizing the final moments before the event began, I felt like I was finally the person I had dreamed of all these years. I was no longer anyone's shadow. I was a woman who was creating my life, my reality. I could stand here, direct the process, and make sure everything worked the way I intended. I wasn't waiting to be noticed. I wasn't waiting for someone to approve of my path. I already knew I could do it on my own. The event went great, and when I looked at the people who were happy, who praised the organization, I felt like I was actually standing on my own. Everything I had built had become a reality. And it was at that moment, as I was walking down the hall, realizing how much I was able to accomplish, that I saw him, Steve. He was standing in the corner discussing a deal with someone, as he always did. His gaze crossed mine, and there was something in his eyes that I couldn't immediately recognize. It wasn't a meeting of hostility, but it wasn't a greeting either. It was a look full of questions. He knew I was here. He knew I had succeeded, and maybe that was what I was always trying to prove to him. I didn't know what he was thinking, but maybe he understood. He might have realized he'd lost me. But I didn't stop. I kept walking, not taking my eyes off him, not paying attention to his gaze. It was a strange feeling. Not anger, not resentment, but not regret either. It was the moment I realized that I didn't want to go back to the world we had. I don't want to be a part of what once felt like my home. I had made my choice, and now I could move on without thinking about the past. It was my path, and I wasn't going to change it to please someone. Steve tried to approach, but I knew I didn't want him to. He might have realized that his world had crumbled, that his familiar order no longer existed. But I was willing to leave him where he was and not let him bring me back to the life I'd left. I had to keep moving forward. When the event was over, I stood among the guests, watching people laughing, enjoying the party. They didn't know how much it had cost me to come here. This was my success, not Steve's, not anyone else's. I did it for me, and that's what made me truly happy. I was able to become a woman who wasn't dependent on someone else's expectations, who could choose her own path, even if that path was difficult and full of challenges. As I moved through the hall, trying not to attract attention, I couldn't help but notice how many people were looking at me, some with admiration, others with curiosity. This was new to me. I had once been part of the background, part of the perfect image. But now I stood here, in the center of this world, and I could feel myself growing more and more confident. I didn't feel fear. I wasn't afraid of losing anything. All that mattered was that I was me, and that I could handle it. Immersed in my thoughts, I felt Steve walk up to me. His face was serious, his gaze wary. He looked at me with such sadness in his eyes that I barely restrained myself from feeling regret. But I knew this wasn't the time for regret. I had made my choice, and this was my time. "You actually made it," he said, and his voice sounded like he was not just surprised, but maybe even disappointed. "Are you proud of that?" he asked, and I caught a question in his words that was more important than I realized. But the answer was simple. I wasn't proud. I was me, and that was all I needed. I wasn't the woman he'd once loved, and I wasn't the woman waiting for him to change. I was a woman who had made the decision to be me. I looked at him, and in that moment, I felt all the weight I'd been carrying in my heart all these years disappear. I was free from him, from his expectations, from the life I had once chosen for him. "I can't be a part of your world anymore, Steve," I said quietly but firmly. "I've made my choice, and now I choose to be me." He was silent for a few seconds and then nodded, as if he realized it was true. I didn't expect him to understand or pity me. All I needed was my own acceptance. I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to look back again. Steve turned and walked away without another word. I stood in that hall, surrounded by people, and I suddenly realized that this was not just an event for me, but a moment of liberation. I was not his wife. I was not the perfect wife that existed in his world. I was a woman searching for my own path, and I had found it. A few weeks went by. I continued to work and grow in my new life without looking back. I was no longer a woman who was trying to conform to other people's expectations. I was a woman who lived for herself and enjoyed every moment of my life. I started meeting new people, traveling, learning new things about both myself and the world around me. I even started writing, gathering my thoughts about what I had experienced. When I thought about it, I realized that everything that had happened had given me the opportunity to get to know myself, to understand who I really was, and that was the most valuable thing of all. One day I got a letter from Steve. It was short, but full of regret. He admitted that he had lost a lot, and although I wasn't looking for his confession, his words didn't go unanswered. I read the letter and realized that he probably now understood what I meant to him. But it didn't matter. I was already different. I didn't expect an apology from him, and frankly, I didn't expect one. I was no longer the woman who expected change from others. I only expected change from myself. At sunset that day, I sat at the window of my new apartment looking out at the city. It seemed so big, so full of possibilities. I was alone, but not lonely. I was happy to be me. It was the beginning of a new life, a life in which I didn't just exist, but lived, living the life I wanted to live. And at that moment, I realized that the most important thing in life is not to be perfect for someone else, but to be real for myself.